We have attempted to define the major currents of style and subject in the late 18th and early 19th centuries as characterized by neoclassicism and romanticism, or in some cases, romantic classicism. In fact, that is something that I tried to get you to see in the unknown on our test. If you were somewhat flummoxed by it, it's because it didn't seem to be fully, perhaps, a neoclassical work, nor fully a romantic work. So we'll talk about that when we get the test back. There are difficulties, obviously, in making absolute distinction about where art fits and where an artist's work specifically fits. But by the middle of the 19th century, artists will become more and more disillusioned in the ideals of what one might argue are the romantic sensibility or the classical sensibility or tradition. Since, as I just said a moment ago, both are in reality avoiding the contemporary world of the artist. Both, in fact, are escapes to find expression in the subject matter and, in some cases, the style of another time and another place. So realism is going to be the movement that will begin to dominate the art of the 19th century and reject, ultimately, romanticism. But it's interesting that this movement, which promoted the idea that art should represent nature without idealization and should represent the world of the artist, was anticipated by one of the most unromantic and unclassical painters who ever lived. And he wasn't even a Frenchman, he was a Spaniard. Francisco José de Goya y Lucientes, known as Goya, G-O-Y-A. Goya painted the world without illusion. He had the ability to explore and understand the world around him and to create extraordinary commentaries on the contemporary world. This does not mean, by the way, that he did not create some works which are quite fantastical, that in a way one might say have a kind of romantic sensibility to them. But for the most part, his works are based in what we will eventually see as the dominant mode of the 19th century, and that is realism. I show you a self-portrait of the artist created sometime between 1790 and 95. He is putting the final touches on a painting. He looks out at us, and there are candles or candle holders in his hat because we know that he often put some final touches on his paintings at night, and so that was his source of light that came from his hat. Because of the starkness and drama of his mature work, of the works that really bespeak Goya, he's sometimes called a romantic, but in fact, as I've said, he was a realist. He was born near Saragossa in Spain, deep in the 18th century. I mean, I hate to do this to you, but here we're going back into the 18th century again. 1746. His art passes through transitional periods of the 18th century, sort of Baroque, Rococo kinds of paintings. He was influenced by the stylistic periods in which he grew up, in which he was trained. But ultimately, when he found his own style, his own tradition, that's when we begin to call him a realist. So he was trained in academic traditions. He even went to Italy in the 1760s to study art. But he would frequently compromise his own tendencies to be original and to be realistic because he received commissions, particularly from the nobility, from the upper classes in Spain, who wanted to see themselves, for instance, taking part in a quail shoot on the left-hand side, or dancing on the banks of the Manzanares River on the right-hand side. In the 1770s, he produced paintings that were copied into woven tapestries at the Royal Tapestry Factory in Madrid. So what you're looking at, to some extent, are very similar to the kinds of paintings he did that would serve as cartoons, as designs that would be transformed into woven tapestries. And they were meant to be interesting and appealing kinds of narratives. They really look very much, if you think back to what you saw of 18th century Rococo paintings, they look very much in that tradition. In May of 1780, he became a member of the Royal Academy of San Fernando, the finest art academy in Spain. The Royal Academy of San Fernando, Fernando. And by 1795, he was the director of the Royal Academy. However, a serious illness would leave Goya deaf at the age of 46 in 1792.
I have a question.
Yes.
Is this the same Goya that did Saturn devouring the sun?
Yes.
Oh my God.
That's why I said there is a fantastical side, but it's very, very late in his career, and there are a lot of interesting stories about. I mean, he had to leave Spain at the time. He was living in the south of France. So we're gonna concentrate on a kind of realist period, but he is extraordinary in terms of the depth and the changes in his art. Many historians feel that the illness that he suffered and the subsequent loss of hearing left him a more pessimistic and isolated individual, and that this would increasingly manifest itself in his works of art. Through the 1790s, he painted portraits of aristocracy and government officials, and he also was given a number of religious commissions. One of the things that we notice about his portraits in the 1790s is that they absolutely, without any apology, tell us the personality of the individual. And this is interesting because if you think about Davidian neoclassicism, David, when he would take on a subject, even Ingres later on, wouldn't tell you much about the personality, but they looked beautiful, didn't they, in that kind of academic classical style. Well, look at Goya. This man is Andrés del Peral. The date is 1798. He was a lawyer and a financial representative of Spain to France from the royal household. And Goya shows us that same pose, by the way, that we've already seen is popular at the time of Napoleon. It continues to be popular with one hand inside of the vest. And what I want you to notice here is that, well, let me ask you, could he not have idealized the face of Andrés del Peral maybe a little bit more? Maybe made him smile a little bit? Instead of a kind of snarling, twisted mouth, instead of a head that's up a little bit, that kind of bespeaks haughtiness. You know, I'm above you. This is who I am. It's a very, I mean, this man frightens me. I don't know if you get the same feeling, but he is rather, as far as I'm concerned, rather intimidated. The beady eyes that look out, you know, at you. I'm looking at you out of the corners of his eyes. Notice that as realistic as this portrait of Andrés del Peral is, that there's great freedom of brushstroke and a very limited tonal range here. Unlike the French academic painters at the end of the 18th century, there is more freedom in Goya's approach to painting. In 1799, Goya was named first painter to the king, and a number of royal commissions followed, including perhaps his most famous painting, The Family of Carlos IV. This is the King of Spain. and his wife, Queen Maria Luisa. It's a very large work, 9 feet 2 inches by 11 feet. 14 almost life-size figures. It has been called, and I quote here, a merciless revelation of royal imbecility. Wow. What's an imbecile? An idiot. So this is a merciless revelation of royal imbecility. This man is first painter to the king. And the painting is seen to modernize, to be very shocking. What you have to understand is the people who are represented in the painting had to acquiesce and agree that they liked it, that they looked good. And they weren't completely imbeciles. But the fact is, the Spanish royal family was scandalous, and there were all kinds of controversies going on. It was known in international courts, and is at home as well, that King Carlos IV was a simple man. All right, that's the nicest way I can put it. He married a once beautiful, but now infamous adulteress, and everyone knew it. So in other words, the queen slept around. The painting, in terms of the composition, is very much based upon Goya's knowledge of a very famous Velázquez painting, a very informal representation of the daughter of the king and queen of Spain, in this case Philip IV, who interrupts Velázquez, the painter, in his studio. So this is a 17th century, mid-17th century painting, which was in the collection of the Spanish royal family, that Goya would have known very well. All right, that's the important point here. So in many ways, and it's a brilliant painting, so in many ways, Goya may be trying to base his work on the Velázquez. One of the things he does is disperse the figures across the picture plane. I mean, there's a little bit of depth and in and out. And then he delimits his space a bit more, but you notice that the background is paintings on a wall. The background is paintings on a wall. The painter is there with his easel. Yes, Velázquez is there with his easel, and that's Goya. You see him in the shadows with his easel to one side. So clearly, this was a source of inspiration for the painting. In the painting of the Spanish royal family, we see how perceptive Goya is, how he cannot fake respect, in a way, for these people. It's an extraordinary work because it shows the weaknesses of individual members of the family. Now, keep in mind, at the time that Goya painted this work, he was earning an enormous tax-free salary, and the painting, in turn, has been described as mocking the people who are paying him this salary. He couldn't afford to antagonize the King of Spain, but he was painting based on his, again, realistic eye. And keep in mind that he did careful studies of every individual. All the members of the royal family came to his studio, or he went to them, and he did studies. And the studies were looked at and scrutinized by the members of the royal family, who said, yes, that's fine. My jewelry looks good. I like my dress, that color, whatever. And they were delighted with the preliminary sketches. Yet Goya has portrayed the vulgarity and the pretentiousness of a royal family that was completely acceptable at the time, to some extent has to convince us that, you wonder which one of these people was the smartest one in the deck, so to speak. Which one of them didn't see, or perhaps didn't care to see, how in essence they seem almost to be caricatured by Goya. And again, I'm not saying it was purposeful on his part. I'm saying that's the kind of painter he is. This is realism. It's not idealization. Portraiture was his forte, and this work represents in many ways his pessimism, his place within the court, and his understanding of these individuals. I want to read to you from what I think has always been a really excellent description of this painting from a book about Goya by Antonina Valentine called The Life and Times of Goya. This I saw, because I think she has brilliantly captured the painting. So let me describe it as she describes it, and I'm quoting from her book here. The finished picture of the family of Charles IV is like a blow planted full in the chest. The curtain has gone up too soon. The actors are standing too close to the footlights. They are jostling against one another as if they are quarreling over questions of place. The spectator feels the embarrassment of a tactless arrival before the hour is set. Every individual wears a costume shot through with iridescent color, but he wears it without regard for his neighbor. Goya takes the greatest care separately of the reflections of silk and velvet, the richness of the embroideries and ornamentations, but he neglects the effect of the whole. From the pictorial point of view, the picture, so resplendent in its details, is in its ensemble dull and spiritless. In the middle of the salon, the queen has created a void around herself. She insists on indicating her place, the first. She is as usual adorned like a reliquary. Her white gown, spangled all over with gold, has a wide gold overskirt that falls in folds like the vestments of a priestess. Her breast bears a galaxy of jewels. Her throat is encircled by multicolored beads. A diamond arrow flashes in her dull, dark hair. She has thrown her head back in a gesture which seems to have been habitual with her, and around this solitary head, Goya has placed a dark space, like a quarantine. A false and slimy smile is plastered on her face, a toad simpering. With a gesture at once theatrical and untried, she's drawing her two youngest children toward her. The Infanta Maria Isabella looks very much like her mother. Her somber eyes seem to know too many sad and hidden things. Don Francisco di Paola resembles his father, as one drop of water resembles another, a common sort of good looks. So, let me see, I don't think, no. So let me go back to here. There was question at the time, a lot of question at the time, about this final child. And you know what I'm going to say, because she was known to be an adulteress, it was thought that he was not the offspring of the king, that he was the offspring of one of the king's ministers. The heir to the throne is standing to the left, foreground. His splendid court costume of light blue velvet studded with decorations is insufficient concealment for his virtually deformed figure, his long dangling arms. He seems to be all the more sinister because in the painting he blocks the light that comes from his side and throws a disproportionate shadow on the carpet and on the women beside him. Of the nearest of these women, nothing is seen but her profile, perhaps his fiancée, who was said to be very ugly, whom he would not meet for another 2 years. So this might seem strange, but this commonly happened in portraits with royalty. So that's why you don't even see this woman's face, because she was not, what she looked like was not known to Goya at this time. Beside the prince stands his younger brother, Don Carlos. See him over here. While behind is the king's sister, the Infanta Maria Josefa, right here. In this old woman's countenance, all the family features can be found, exaggerated to the point of farce. The round eyes popping out of her head, opaque, pale blue, the color of dirty marbles. The long nose drooping to graze the upper lip. The nutcracker chin turning up, festooned with flabby flesh. It is a witch's face. In the group to the left of the queen, the king is stepping into the foreground. The ribbons of noble orders are spread across his costume of brown velvet, embroidered with silver stars of honor gleaming. The golden fleece sparkles around his neck. From this royal splendor, his head emerges, weak, slack, pitiful, in its vain effort to keep an expression of dignity, while his dull gaze gives up the struggle in advance. Behind the king, his body concealed by him, the Infanta Don Antonio repeats his brother's features like a caricature, his goggle eyes watery blue and bewildered, his mouth sagging in imbecility. At his side, the Infanta Carlota Joaquin. The picture is completed by one couple, the Prince Luis of Parma and his wife, the Infanta Maria Luisa, with a child in her arms. It seems that the royal couple of Spain had been able to bring only maimed or abnormal children into the world, and that the Infanta Maria Luisa had one shoulder higher than the other and spinal curvature. It's also said that Goya liked her, and that he tries to camouflage the spinal curvature by having her hold the baby. So it's as though she's trying to balance the baby. Antonina Valentine ends her description of Goya's painting. Here the gallery of monsters or abortions comes to an end. Wow. Goya, who was a contemporary of David, was largely incapable of the kind of idealizing flattery with which, for instance, David would paint Napoleon at this same period of time, 1800. Between 1807 and 1808, speaking of Napoleon, the armies of France marched into Spain. The Spanish viewed the French as an army of liberation and independence from the corrupt politics of the Spanish court, which we have just seen represented by Goya. The general belief at the time was that Napoleon was coming to support the accession of Ferdinand VII after the forced abdication of Carlos, whose whole family we just saw. But optimism was short-lived because Napoleon had no intention of allowing yet another Spaniard to rule Spain. Who did he put on the throne of Spain? Do you remember? Who did Napoleon put? His brother, yes. He made his brother Joseph the king of Spain. What's worse than having an incompetent Spaniard? Having a damn Frenchman as king of Spain. The Spanish began a war of independence, which was to see thousands of people killed, and Goya documented the violent engagements in a series of paintings and prints, which have become rightly famous. This is a work called The 2nd of May, 1808, a work which documents an uprising in Madrid between a crowd of Spaniards and Napoleon's troops, who, if they look somewhat exotic to you, and I think I have a little bit closer view, is because they were mercenaries called Mamluks, M-A-M-E-L-U-K-E-S, Muslims from North Africa, originally from Egypt, which Napoleon had conquered, and they were now part of the Napoleonic army. And they are cutting down the Spaniards here, who have only knives, while the others have obviously more efficient weapons. Goya would also immortalize the mass executions carried out Subsequently, on the nights of May the 2nd and May the 3rd, one of his most famous paintings called The 3rd of May, 1808. Stylistically, this is a very important painting for Goya because unlike the family of Carlos IV, painted about 8 years earlier, where there was, in fact, quite a bit of attention to detail, what we see here is an approach to painting in which the method is very broad strokes, very stark value contrast, again, reducing the amount of contrast and tonality, areas of acid color, for instance, that yellow of the pants of the man whose arms are flung out at the moment that he is to be shot dead. Figures are distorted and flattened, and the light is completely manipulated, although we are to understand that the killing went on all night, and the only source of light was this large lantern here. Goya certainly establishes the lantern as a source of light, where we see it coming out and revealing the horrendous scene of these individuals who are literally piled on top of each other, and the blood is flowing out. He also manipulates the light for the dramatic effect. The painting emphasizes the terror of the condemned, whose faces appear, and of course represent every man, particularly the one figure here who is defiant, who raises his chin and opens his eyes. Goya has achieved an even more inhuman and impersonal feeling of horror, because as we see the faces of the Spaniards, those who are standing there, those who are coming up the hill, we do not see the face of one Frenchman. They are anonymous. They are ignominious because of that. The upraised arms of that central figure, whom I pointed out, is in fact a very specific reference to him as the sacrifice. And you remember that painters use that kind of symbolism to make specific reference to Christ and to the crucifixion, the arms up, spread out, sacrificing himself for his country's independence. Goya portrays a contemporary event without any kind of stoic or classicizing approach that one might see in French academic painting of the period. Even when we talk about Jericho and the raft of the Medusa, you remember around 1817, a few years later, Jericho, showing a contemporary event, idealizes things, makes the bodies more perfect and more beautiful. Here, it is certainly not the same compared to that tradition that we saw of the dead bodies on the raft of the Medusa. Goya's art attempts to document the cataclysmic changes in Spanish society in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, not only through his paintings, but also through his prints. Prior to the French occupation of Spain, he had begun a series of prints which were published in book form at the very end of the 18th century, in 1799. The series was known as Los Caprichos, the Caprices. That's L-O-S, new word, capital C-A-P-R-I-C-H-O-S, Los Caprichos. He created these prints through basically the etching process. A process in which the artist draws usually on a metal plate. The plate is then has been covered with and sealed with a kind of waxy surface. Wherever the artist draws into the plate, it reveals the metal. The metal is put into an acid bath, and that acid actually eats away the lines. And so this is what's called an etching, and multiple prints can be pulled from an etching. This is probably the most famous of that whole series of Los Caprichos. The sleep of reason produces monsters. Number 43. It's about 8 inches tall and 5 inches wide, so it's modest in size. It shows an artist, Goya himself perhaps, sleeping at his workbench, surrounded by nightmares, visions of owls, night creatures, bats. And there is a lynx, or kind of cat, on the ground just behind the artist. And the most ominous aspect of the whole work is that one of the owls has sort of taken on human characteristics and has literally picked up the brush or the tool of the artist and is trying to get the artist in his dreamlike stupor, in his dreaming of these monsters, to set to work, to in fact represent the monsters of his dreams. Goya explained the meaning of the work with this inscription. He said, "Fantasy, abandoned by reason, produces impossible monsters. Fantasy united with reason is the mother of the arts and the origin of their marvels." So fantasy abandoned by reason creates monsters, but fantasy united with reason is the mother of the arts. And he saw reason as the only hope for a superstitious, medieval, corrupt Spain of the end of the 18th century. Goya's most important series of etchings were done in response to the French invasion and occupation of Spain. He worked on a series of etchings between 1810 and 1820. He eventually gave the series the title, "The Fatal Consequences of Spain's Bloody War with Bonaparte." The Fatal Consequences of Spain's Bloody War with Bonaparte. But the works are more commonly known as the disasters of war. They were not actually fully published together until 1863. Goya by now has a kind of full mastery of the etching technique. He uses it to express his own style, which tends to simplify. This is not the kind of etching, for instance, that French academic painters were taught to draw from, because you don't see that same kind of contour and line that you would have seen in a kind of classic etching, because Goya has his own style. The technique, in fact, adds to the immediacy of our being able to read the subject, the sense of chaos and smoke and light and dark in the background behind this figure, which clearly, it's the very first in the series, and in fact is a figure of humanity. That's you. That's me. We are down on our knees. We are looking up to heaven, and we are asking God, how much more can we take? What are we to expect from this? This is a kind of foreboding of what is to come. So I want to show you a few other examples from this series, and I will actually not say anything. I think not until Pablo Picasso's very famous painting called Guernica, that tells of the aerial bombing of an innocent city in the Basque region of Spain under the aegis of Francisco Franco, have we seen a greater indictment of war than these works created by Goya so long ago. Goya gave titles to all of the etchings. I think the one that is the most stirring is the one where he says, "And this I saw." So he wants you to know, I'm not making this up. We return now to France. We're going to concentrate more and more on the 19th century. The 19th century in France was perhaps as busy a period for revolution, or the importance of revolution, as the 18th century, although perhaps none of the revolutions of the 19th century can match the French Revolution of 1789. We know that Louis XVI had been executed in 1793. We saw David's drawing of his queen, Marie Antoinette, on her way to the guillotine. We also know that Louis XVI, although he died, was survived by two brothers who escaped and went to England. The Louis whom we're talking about, this family whom we're talking about, are referred to as the Bourbon, the Bourbon monarchy, because that's the family name. B-O-U-R-B-O-N, Bourbon, Bourbon. The Bourbon, the monarchy in France, was reestablished in 1814 when Napoleon was defeated. And the brother of Louis XVI, who had gone into exile, was proclaimed King of France, Louis XVIII. Louis XVIII ruled prudently. He'd better. His brother had been guillotined just a few years earlier. He was aware of the importance of the newly established liberties in France. There were laws that were made, put forward in a two-house legislature, so France was increasingly, of course, allowing governance from levels other than the very top. When Louis XVIII died in 1824, his brother, Charles X, was crowned and was supported by ultra-royalists who felt that enough time had passed now in terms of the French Revolution and the loss of the order, the natural order of monarchy, that in fact it was time for what was known as the ancien régime, the former regime, monarchy, to be re-established. A-N-C-I-E-N, and another word, R-E-G-I-M-E, ancien régime. In other words, there were those now in the first quarter of the 19th century who thought that France could be returned to the traditions of the 18th century. I simply show you this portrait so you get a sense of, gosh, it looks like we're going back to the time of Louis XIV again, with all of the splendor here and the symbols of power and wealth. This is Charles X. Charles X began to reestablish powers of kingship in France. And literally, he probably went too quickly, but he was determined. He put forward a series of acts which included reviving the privileged titles of aristocracy, proposing to pay the aristocracy billions of francs in compensation for what they had lost in the revolution. He disbanded the National Guard, a citizens' militia. Over and over again, he denounced the kinds of curtailments of power that had occurred since the fall of monarchy and wanted to reestablish ultimate authority with kingship. He dissolved the legislature, the Chamber of Deputies, and he had electoral laws revised to deny voting rights to much of the middle class. Whoa. The result, the Revolution of 1830, in which the French took up arms against the king, who abdicated and went back to England. Eugène Delacroix commemorated the three-day Revolution of 1830 in an extraordinary painting. It's called The 20th of July, Liberty Leading the People, finished in 1831. This is the only major painting inspired by a contemporary event in France that Delacroix ever painted. In many ways, even though we talk about him as the great romantic artist, one wonders if he really was of his own time, because he was interested in Orientalism, if you remember. He was interested in the exotic. He was interested in the sublime in his art. But in this case, he was inspired by a contemporary event. All ages and classes of people, living and dead, seem to be represented at the barricade. Corpses are sprawled out in front of us. It's almost a reminiscence of Géricault's Raft of the Medusa, which had inspired Delacroix, as we know, in his very early career. The large, partially nude figure of Liberty, carrying a French flag and a rifle, can be understood as a personification. I just called her Liberty. A personification in painting or art is a representation of an abstract concept or an aspect of nature that you want to realize in human form. And so she becomes a personification. But the problem is personifications are used in a different kind of painting, not in a painting that is particularly realistic. Delacroix is supposedly showing us an actual contemporary event, the barricades here in Paris. The French, the common French, coming forward to fight against the king. And he puts in an academic classical tradition of a partially nude, heroic-sized female personification. And then he shows us blood and guts down below of the actual event. It's extremely artificial. There's a lot of problems with trying to put that kind of, romantic fervor of the personification of liberty and the reality here. And it's as though he's trying to find some kind of balance, and it simply doesn't work that well. I'm not saying it's not an extraordinarily good painting, but in the context of our talking about realism, it simply doesn't work. The July Revolution of 1830 resulted in a compromise. A cousin of the deposed monarch was awarded the crown. His name was Louis Philippe. Louis-Philippe. Louis Philippe. A more modest man, he was called the Citizen King. He courted the bourgeoisie, he encouraged them. He went so far as to popularize himself as a businessman, and the bourgeoisie are the middle class. They are the businessmen of France. The Industrial Revolution had begun. Steam engines were powering factories. Industrialization was promoting both prosperity and deprivation. Most of the latter, of course, for the lower classes who were exploited for the sake of industrialization. Workers were not allowed to strike. There was simply no such thing as not going to work because you didn't like your working conditions. And there were no avenues for grievances. I mean, the concept of a grievance in a democratic society and having an orderly way to put forward a grievance. We even have this grievance process on this campus for students who are unhappy about some aspect of classroom or working with any of the offices on campus. You can put forth a grievance. Well, that was not something that was known in the 19th century, but will come about as a result of social reform. Eventually, too many things happened, and Louis Philippe was dethroned, and he fled to England after the Revolution of 1848. So I told you, none of these revolutions perhaps compare. We're certainly not as bloody as the Revolution of 1789, but there are quite a few of them, and they're going to have import for us as we begin to talk about the art that's produced in this historical period. The Second Republic was then proclaimed in 1848 with an elected president. You want to know his name? Well, I'm going to tell you. The elected president was Prince Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, the exiled nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. This is like a door that's, a sliding door or a door that goes around and around. I mean, how many members of the Bourbon family, how many Bonapartes are they? We keep recycling them. But Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, in fact, decided that he wanted more power, and in 1851, he declared himself Emperor Napoleon III. His coup d'etat, as it is referred to, C-O-U-P, D'-E-T-A-T, the takeover, coup d'etat, C-O-U-P, another word, D'-E-T-A-T, in 1851, was ratified, and he went on to rule as a quote-unquote benevolent despot. A benevolent despot. This is a portrait of Napoleon III from around 1862. The only thing I'll say about it, because you don't have to know, although the artist Flandrin was a very important artist in the 19th century, all I would want you to know is Flandrin was a student of Ingres. So if you see any Ingres or David in this portrait, that's because it's a direct line down to him. In 1853, Emperor Napoleon III, this man, appointed a chief administrator of Paris to reorganize and rebuild parts of the city, including widening the streets and cleaning up the slums. Why do you want to widen the streets? Well, because there have been so many revolutions where the people in the tiny little short streets can have an advantage over the military coming in. They want to clear those streets out, have nice wide streets. You can bring your entire army down. You also want to clear out the slums because that's where you're going to have probably many of the troublemakers. So Napoleon's motive was to make it more difficult for the Parisians to rise up in revolution. And the man he appointed is a man named Baron Haussmann. Capital B as in boy, A-R-O-N. capital Haussman, Haussman, Haussman. The reason that Paris has the wide boulevards that it does today, there in Haussman, no uprisings in small streets, no small barricades. France went to war with Prussia in 1870 and was defeated. And after the Prussian victory, the French revolted against Napoleon III and established a republic. It's about time. This is actually the Third Republic, and there is a national assembly, a legislature. I've given you this background, again, because now I'm going to show you some works of art and talk about an artist whose style, whose subject evolved in this very wild historical period.
Can you repeat which year they revolted again?
In 1870, after the loss to the Prussians. So what is the subject matter of this painting? Well, what's the title? The Uprising, all right? And we don't know the precise date. It's usually dated to around 1860. No one knows for sure when Honoré Daumier painted this subject. The subject matter itself, the uprising, the idea that we have some common French who are marching en masse along a street in Paris, allows a wide nomination of possible dates from the Revolution of 1830, the 1848 Revolution, the coup d'etat of 1851, or even later, if it was painted later, the Paris Commune of 1871. But it is one of the early masterpieces by the French painter Honoré Daumier. Daumier is not known as a painter, but as an illustrator, a printmaker. None of his work was admitted into the Salon until 1848, which was a special year when practically anyone who showed up at the door got to show their work. Like his finest realistic prints, there is no liberty leading the people here. Do you notice that? It is realism to the core. There is a man with his shirt sleeves up, rolled back, who has his mouth open, who is shouting, who is leading a group of others in protest against the status quo. The surging crowd pushing to the front of the picture plane makes for a very realistic, very effective painting. And what I want you to notice is somewhat like Goya, I would say, whom he did not know the work of Goya, is almost crude in the style of the drawing, in the strong contrast of light and dark. It seems completely unrelated to the classical tradition. Now, I must tell you, Daumier did have some formal atelier training. So he trained with a master for a period of time, but he hated academic routine, and he hated academic formalism, academic classicism. Just as Goya chose not to idealize the world around him, Daumier drew and painted the contemporary scene in a very direct way. But just as Goya, and I really love this about Daumier, this is sort of life-saving for me and why I really care for this artist, is he did not idealize, neither did Goya, but Goya was a profound pessimist, depressingly profound pessimist in almost all of his work. Daumier has such a good sense of humor. He knows humans are idiots. He knows they do stupid, awful, terrible things. But he's the eternal optimist, and he wants us to kind of laugh at our foibles. He thinks that people are foolish, but they're basically good. And he takes that up in a whole series of works, which he does for publications in France. And I must say that increasingly in France in the 19th century, we begin to see open publication, journals and newspapers, so that people can begin to know what's going on. There is censorship, so that is an issue, but more and more people are aware of what's going on. But look at it, just to show you a couple of his wonderful images, and I'll talk about his technique and the medium in a moment. But on the left-hand side, have you ever gone to the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion, and there may have been an opera or something that you wanted to see, but you didn't have the money, so you waited, and you went at the last minute, and you could either buy a ticket in the bloody nose seats, way up at the top, that was pretty cheap, or someone was outside trying to get rid of a ticket, and so you bought a cheap ticket and got in. You must have done this at some point. So, in fact, that's what Daumier is referencing here. He says, a literary discussion in the second balcony. The second balcony is the bloody nose balcony. They're the worst seats. They're the cheapest seats. That's where, you and I, the ordinary people, can afford to sit. But what's wonderful about it is this is not a literary discussion. A literary discussion among the lowest classes for Daumier means they're going to knock the crap out of each other. That's how they're going to communicate. And then he has a great deal to say about women, I have to say. And one of the things that I find funny is they are no longer women, they are balloons. Because in the middle of the 19th century, these huge petticoats came out. And all the most stylish women were wearing these huge skirts. And I have to tell you, in the public parks, the gardeners were supposedly beside themselves. Because as your skirt moves along, it's dragging the petunias and pansies out with it, and sort of destroying the flower beds. And so Daumier tells us there are no longer women, they are balloons. Daumier was born in the south of France, in Marseille, in 1808, but he grew up in Paris. He began working for a weekly periodical at the age of 22. There were a whole series of these periodicals, these magazines, which were important sources of information about social and political events of the time. There's a lot of commentary and a lot of criticism of what was going on. And this is, of course, very important in a kind of open democratic society. These newspapers were combating censorship through their images. Images were a threat to the establishment because most people couldn't read. So I'm saying here that Daumier, who had a way of crystallizing some attitudes or some words, was able to put it into a picture so that people could understand, oh, so that's what the government is doing. That's what they're trying to take away from us. So artists were increasingly important to reveal, the reality of the times. This is one of the weekly periodicals he worked for. It's actually called The Caricature. Daumier's medium for the production of his political cartoons was a medium called lithography, a printmaking technique invented relatively late compared to other techniques like etching, which is much older. It was invented at the end of the 18th century by a German. And lithography was actually invented because they needed to find a way to create, they didn't have a Xerox machine, first of all, and they needed to find a way, that was a joke, they needed to find a way to make multiples. Now, with etching and engraving and even woodblock, you can make a certain number of multiples, but after a while, the plate will wear out. And lithography seemed to be the way to go. They were trying to find a way to reproduce musical scores, because into the 18th century, copying of musical scores were done by people who copied them all day. you know, and if you did your quarter note wrong or did, you know, double half note or full note where it wasn't supposed to be, then you made a mistake. So this was a way to be sure that you were going to get all of what you wanted correct. It was a rapid, convenient, inexpensive technique based on drawing with a greasy pencil directly on a prepared stone, which is then inked and printed.
What's a greasy pencil?
Sorry?
What's a greasy pencil?
It's like a crayon, which is a kind of greasy pencil. So I love this site on the Museum of Modern Art in New York. I'm going to have fun with it now. It's called What is a Print? And so it actually, it says it was invented by a German actor and writer, Alois Senfelder. Press the arrow to start. So you draw on the stone. I'm going to grab the greasy pencil. Just don't mind me while I have some fun here. An artist draws an image on a polished slab of limestone. The artist can also draw on a specially prepared metal plate instead of limestone. But the German inventor had, in fact, experimented with a number of different surfaces, and he found this particular kind of limestone to be particularly good. So here I've drawn, you see I've drawn an elephant. So what happens next? The stone is wiped with a chemical solution. I'm going to grab the brush. The solution will cause the image to attract the greasy printer's ink. The blank areas will repel the ink and attract water. Fixing the image. The stone is wiped with a solvent such as turpentine to dissolve most of the original drawing. However, a slightly greasy ghost-like image remains. The drawing has been securely bonded or fixed to the stone. All right. I already did that. The surface of the stone is then dampened with water. Pick up my sponge here. Which is absorbed by only the blank areas. This simple step prepares the surface for inking up. Oil-based printing ink is applied to the stone with a roller. See if I can grab it on one end. Because grease and water do not mix, the ink adheres to the image but is repelled by the wet blank surface. And then finally, the ink stone is placed on a bed of a lithographic press. A sheet of damp paper is laid on top, padded with a board, and placed under the pressure bar, which exerts even pressure as it goes through the press. Okay, I better get it to go. Okay. The finished print is lifted away from the stone. The image has been printed in reverse. If more than one color is needed, separate stones are used for each color. Is that just the coolest website? That's the most fun I have talking about lithography, I'll tell you. So that's the Museum of Modern Art in New York. You can find it very easily. Printmaking Techniques, MoMA. Okay, and then I have my very ordinary drawing here to show you, again, that lithographic technique. The lithographic stone can be re-inked and multiples can be pulled. So it's a very efficient way to create large, almost unlimited quantities of prints. In 40-some years of lithographic production, Daumier created over 4,000 lithographic drawings. He created a new standard that lifted the political cartoon to the level of serious art. For example, this is his political cartoon, for which, by the way, he was imprisoned for 6 months. That is King Louis Philippe, whom you may or may not remember, ruled from 1830 to 1848. And Daumier shows Louis Philippe sitting on a throne, which is actually also a toilet, because from the bottom of it are all of his decrees coming out. You see all those pieces of paper? And then the legislators are coming down and they're picking them up and they're going to go forward with them. So where is the king getting all of his money? Well, you can see it in the front. It comes from the poor who are giving every last cent. And the king is obviously being represented as a glutton. Daumier has made literary reference here to the French folk hero Gargantua, a 16th century character whom the French knew very well. This folk character, Gargantua, whom you see represented in the upper right-hand corner from a French printmaking factory called the Images of Epinal. Gargantua was this monster, this huge figure, a glutton who ate whole sheep and cows for dinner, who could never be satisfied. And in Daumier's work, the king is, of course, Gargantua, so he becomes a laughable figure. The king, by the way, has not only a pear-shaped body, but that's a pear-shaped head, if I've ever seen the fruit. In French, une poire, a pear, is sort of like a couch potato. It's a slang expression for a lazy couch potato. And so it's slang, and the king is being referenced as une poire. Daumier was brought up on charges. Get this. Imagine if this would happen to political cartoonists today with our politicians. He was tried on charges of disrespect and hatred against the king and the government, and he went to jail for 6 months. Do you have any idea what politicians in this country, and I am thinking of the president, put up with in terms of not just political cartoons, because those are often actually quite interesting and funny and have an interesting point of view. In 1834, Daumier published a powerful lithograph dealing with yet another incident in which he is referencing the problems with the government, where the poor had suffered at the overreaction of the government. This is the Rue Transnonain Street, 1834. A new law in France said that all secret societies had to be overseen directly by the government. I just said secret societies. Whether this was a secret labor union or a secret club for whatever, you are no longer a secret society if the government is allowed to oversee what you are doing. This was, of course, the government's way of trying to keep tabs on the developing trade union movement in France, and was meant to create certainly a certain amount of impotence in terms of the people coming together to organize. Riots broke out in a number of cities in France, and in Paris the riots were put down by government troops who were called out. One specific army battalion was reacting to what was said to be a sniper in one of the apartment buildings on the Rue Transnonain. They burst into the building, into apartments, ended up killing 8 men, a woman, and a child who had nothing to do with any sniper. It is said they were asleep in their beds. And Daumier wants to show you the injustice of it. In a very direct fashion, with no idealization, no romantic approach to the scene, he shows us an ordinary Frenchman, certainly not based in the drawing on the academic classical tradition, because Daumier's style is not academic classical. It's a short, stumpy man here, an ordinary-looking face, and it looks as though he's in his nightshirt, and he has jumped out of bed because people were breaking down his door, and he was shot dead. not only was he shot dead, but the baby in the bed with them and his wife who was running away were shot dead. And let's add in the grandfather for good measure. So this becomes a story of great significance and an indictment of government policy and overreaction in which the common people, again, are the losers. It is Daumier who said, "Il faut être de son temps." You have to be of your own time. You have to be of your own time. And that struggle for realism in art would be carried on by another Frenchman, a good friend of Daumier, whom Daumier greatly admired, and we'll take up with him on Monday. His name is Gustave Courbet.